She won't be coming out with me anymore. And she will be exhausted.
Well, welcome to the first presentation of the 5th annual Tony Woyak History Festival. Sweet. So, yay. And this is exciting because we all came out tonight and we are going to learn something that we know nothing about, unless you're different than I am. And I just went, oh, hooray, a new thing. So we're all quite excited about that. This wonderful series is a cooperative effort from the Washburn Area Historical Society and the Washburn Heritage Association, and it's made possible in part by a grant from the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And we are very pleased to have that affiliation as well, and also to benefit from the participation of all the volunteers and caring community members who make organizations which love local history possible and sustainable. Now, I'd like to say that in addition to the funds we get from the Humanities Council, the Heritage Association and the Washburn Area Historical Society share the responsibility for the hospitality and the music that you're going to enjoy after the show and a little bit before the show by Zach Olson. So we're very pleased to be able to offer that and hope you enjoyed the goodies. Our speaker this evening is very, very well known around here, so I don't need to go on and on about him. He had an illustrious career with the National Park Service, and he lives in Washburn now with his wife and a variety of animals. You've probably seen hanging out of his car at various times. And so I asked him before the presentation what he would like me to say by way of introduction, and he told me, so here he is. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, and able to leap tall buildings at a single bound.
Thank you. Faster than a speeding turtle, able to stumble across the front row of the seats without tripping over too many of my fellow citizens of Washburn. It's very much an honor to be invited back. When Eddie said the 5th annual Tony Woyak History Festival, that really made me feel good. I remember we all getting together, Carla and Ken and Shirley and everybody else, to organize the first one. And how nice to think we're on our 5th year. I'd also like to add one little sponsor caveat. As Carla, if I'm not mistaken, there was also a grant from the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy, correct?
Not for the winter.
Not for the winter, for the summer. There we go. All right. Well, come back in the summer and we'll do that too. Well, we'll have to make sure that that's taken care of next year. Okay, that's good. I'm glad to get that straightened out, and as I say, we'll see about that. Anyway, God. You know, sometimes when I do one of these programs, I say, oh, how nice of you folks to come out on such a lovely evening and come here for one of my programs. That doesn't really spring readily to mind tonight. But on the other hand, I'm really impressed, surprised, and pleased by the crowd that came out tonight on such a cold night. But I'll suggest that we all take our minds back to a very, very similar night in 1898 when a crowd about 10 times this size assembled across the street from here outdoors at the railroad station, which was not far at all from where we are sitting in warm comfort. On the night, February 2nd, 1898, there was a really big outdoors hoop-de-doo, and the newspaper reported on it in very breathless terms the next morning. The Washburn Times, the Klondike party has gone. The 9:15 train this evening bore them away, and as the conductor swung his lantern and shouted, all aboard! A chorus of hip hip hurrah went up from a crowd of over 500 voices as there were fully that number of people gathered on the platform to bid goodbye to our friends. Let's see how this works here. Yay. Is our thing working here? Scott, Chuck?
Modern technology.
Scott? Hello, Scott.
Hello?
Yeah. Our slide advance seems to be a little sluggish in the cold weather. And, yeah, right. If it doesn't work, I'll just holler slide, okay, Scott? Thank you. A chorus of over 500 voices yelling, "Time for the slide!" No, gathered on the platform to bid goodbye to our friends. Sleds, clothing, bedding, and supplies of all kinds were loaded in the car, well nigh filling it. There were over 50 dogs taken along. Yeah, give it a shot there, will you? The scene at the depot was a touching one. A number of our best citizens were taking their departure to be gone for many months, perhaps years. The course before them was rough and dangerous, and in penetrating the frozen regions of the north, they will be compelled to encounter the severest of trials and hardships. Some of these boys, filled with courage and eager for the trip, may never return. Home ties have been severed, and no one can tell when they will be reunited. When one of these men stooped to bid farewell and kiss, maybe for the last time, who knows, their children and wives, many and I could not suppress a tear. And in fact, in one sad case, that was quite true. A better lot of men never left Washburn in any one party. Godspeed, you boys, on your way. May your journey be free from accident, and your return crowned with success. Well, not everybody felt that way. Matter of fact, there was a fellow in the crowd from Ashland who felt quite differently, and had taken the train up. I watched the Ashland paper the next day. He said, a resident of Ashland lost his large pet dog about 6 weeks ago and went by train to Washburn last night to see the party off and take a farewell look at his dog, but was disappointed as the dog is not in the party. Now that insinuation did not sit well with the editor of the Washburn Times, who obviously rigged his competition, because in the next week he replied, Ashland may send dog thieves to the Klondike, but Washburn is not sending that class of men. So, what's this all about? I mean, where are they going? What are they doing? And why did the screen go blank? All righty, let's see. Scott?
It should work.
It should work. And this one's
I'll turn it off. Hang on a second.
Yeah, well, this is the story of the Klondike Gold Rush. Next slide, if you could just advance manually, that would be helpful. Can we get to the next one? There we go. What was it all about? What prompted a half dozen solid citizens of our town to pick up and head off this way? Well, let's drop back to the very beginnings of it, and we're in the absolute boondocks of the continent, on the very interior of the Yukon Territory in Canada. And on August 16, 1896, an American prospector named George Carnac, who was there with his wife, a Tagish Indian named Kate, and her brother, a guy named Skook, who went by the name in English of Skookum Jim, Skookum being a little settlement, and their nephew Charlie. They struck gold on a little creek that became known as Bonanza Creek in a very remote area of the Yukon Territory, and they immediately filed a claim. And because the four of them, 3 Native Americans and 1 white guy, were suspicious of the government, they decided it would probably be best if the white guy files the claim, because they'll steal it from us natives. And that's the way they did. They filed the claim in the name of George Carmack, but actually it was probably the brother-in-law, Jim, who made the find. Very remote area of the Yukon near a small settlement which later became known as Dawson City. The news spread pretty rapidly in the backcountry, all the people who were there. And by that winter, that little settlement of Dawson, which now called Dawson City, had 500 people. And that was it for a while, because this is the winter and nobody's getting out of there. And for several months, those early birds had to dig into themselves. And it took a lot longer for the news to get out, but when it got out, it went with a bang. And if you advance the slide one there, Scott. Yeah, okay, we're great this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee you that. The news came out when a ship landed in San Francisco with a bunch of miners with a lot of gold to throw around. As it says right there, 68 rich men on the steamer Portland. Well, yes, indeed. It was they called the steamer Portland, and another source that I see was a steamship called the Excelsior. And on board were miners bringing, say, $500,000 worth of gold, which would be about $14 million worth today. Caused an uproar. How big of a deal? A very big deal. Let me put it this way. You want to try this? Yeah, okay. That's why it worked. Mr. Technology here is pressing on the wrong button, the button that makes it go blank. Okay. Thank you, sir. Okay. Now, with that out of the way, we are back to San Francisco, where it has hit the fan in a very big way, to the point that let me just give you an idea of the uproar it caused. The mayor of Seattle is in San Francisco at a convention. He never went back to Seattle. He quit right there and then, sent a telegram to Seattle and said, find another mayor, I'm buying a boat, we're all going to go up to the Klondike. By the time it was done, 1/4 of the Seattle police force had followed him. This is the kind of uproar. Now, think about it for a minute, because I'll tell you why, some of the context. Number one, the country had just been through a really bruising economic panic a few years before that. It was just getting back on its feet, still on the gold standard. And this is a time when the Wild West era is coming to a close. The idea of the end of the frontier has pretty much descended on America. And men who wanted to go west and seek fortune, there wasn't anywhere for them to go at that point. And then suddenly this new horizon, this new frontier opens up, and a lot of folks responded. The news reached Washburn in a week. Okay, it took 6 months to get out from the interior, and then a week, that's all, to get to Washburn, Wisconsin, where the Washburn Times published a similar article to this one. At 3 o'clock this morning, steamship from Seattle passed up the Sound with more than a ton of solid gold on board and 68 passengers, hardly a man of whom has less than $7,000 of gold. And that would be, the poorest guy had $200,000 in modern terms worth of gold. And then here's the part in the Washburn Times article that jumped out at me. Fortune seemed to smile on the inexperienced men who went into the mining district late last year, as all of the tenderfeet were lucky. Okay, encouraging people who don't know what they're doing to go into the wilderness is not really the best thing. But this is kind of what happened with the Klondike Goldrush. An awful lot of bank clerks and other folks who weren't big on the outdoors all of a sudden decided they were going to go to the frozen north and get rich. And that inexperience did, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but it did turn into a huge problem. And it became clear to the Canadian government, remember this is in Canada, that there was a disaster in the making. There was already a couple of episodes in Dawson City, which is absolutely bursting at the gills in a matter of a couple of months. That came close to famine. So the Canadian government put their foot down and said, no one is admitted across the border without a year's worth of provisions. And that means pretty much a ton of food. And then with all the other gear that the Canadian government required, and they had a whole checklist before they let you cross the border. Basically, every man-jack among them had to be toting about 2 tons worth of food and supplies. I don't know about you, but I can't carry that kind of load anymore. So it made for a lot of logistical hassles, and we're going to hear about some of them really close up in a minute. But across the country, this whole issue of Klondike Fever sprung up, and everybody who had an idea decided, let's give it a shot, and we're going to head up to the Klondike. People found different ways of making money, of course. It wasn't necessarily the gold miners who made money, but there was a lot of ways to make money off the gold miners. And there were companies publishing guidebooks written by people who'd never set foot in the frozen north. One of the things that really cracked me up as I'm doing the research for this, looking at all the different ads that turn up in the Washburn newspapers for Klondike-related supplies. Every week in the Washburn Times for several months, there was an ad for a company that sold maps telling you how to get to the Klondike. There were ads for Klondike brand cigars. There were ads for boots. And my favorite was an advertisement for baking powder that was got up to look like a newspaper article blended in with the typeface and all. And it says, are you going to Alaska? The universal critical diet in that country depends upon bread and biscuits. And to make the bread and biscuits, either in the camp or on the trail, yeast cannot be used. It must be baking powder. And then they went on to talk about how their baking powder was the only one that would work in the rugged conditions of the Klondike trails. And I'm thinking, if that is running every week in the Washburn Times, it's probably running in papers all across the country. And the kind of money that's being thrown around one way or the other on this whole media phenomenon, they didn't use that term in those days, but it very much was enormous. And you'll also notice in that baking powder ad, are you going to Alaska, a degree of confusion about the geography of it all. And that's understandable because it's a convoluted kind of arrangement in a lot of ways. And just as a recap, give you an idea where all this is going on. You see the X in the map, all right? That's in Canada. Canada is a very large country on the North American continent, most of whose population lives to the south of us here in Washburn. They are known for giving the world Justin Bieber, but they also gave us Neil Young, so it kind of balances out. Yukon. The Yukon Territory is one of Canada's 3 federal territories. It's not a province, it's a territory like Wisconsin was before statehood in 1848. The Yukon River, which you see, is by far the biggest and most important watercourse in that part of the continent. It starts down there in British Columbia, flows through the Yukon Territory, through Alaska, and out into the Bering Sea. So you've got 2 countries involved. And the Klondike River, which really doesn't show up on the map there, is a smaller tributary of the Yukon. Sometimes hard to keep things straight. What also made life hard to keep things straight is to get to the Klondike territory in Canada, you had to cross through Alaska in the United States. Down there in the lower panhandle is basically the way most people got there. And just to confuse things a little more, U.S. and Canada are pretty much best buddies nowadays, but even as recently as the turn of the 20th century, there was a number of sticking points between the two countries, and where the border was between the Alaskan panhandle and British Columbia was pretty much a bone of contention. And finally, as a compromise, the two countries said, all right, we're not giving up our rights on the other side, but for now we'll say that the Canadian border is at the top of the passes. And the Canadians set up their customs posts there. And as I say, getting to there, there was a number of ways. Several different routes were involved. And there was, for instance, one route that did go all the way through Canada, I think called the All-Canadian Route or the Edmonton Trail, and actually some guys from Ashland gave that a shot. If you see over there to the right there, the All-Canada Route, it wasn't exactly a piece of cake. If you, reading an article in the Ashland News from September 1899, they reported on 4 men from Ashland who had just returned from 2 years in the Klondike, and it says they described them as victims of the Edmonton Trail. As they stepped off the steamer Capilano at the pier in Vancouver, they looked like wild men. J.N. Bagger, the leader, had not had a haircut or shave for nearly 2 years, and his hair and beard met on his chest. Bagger said, the strangest thing to me is that we're still here alive, broken in health and spirits, but still active. We have traveled incessantly for nearly 20 months. There was scarcely a day this summer that we were not wading through water, sometimes up to our knees, oftener up to our thighs. Our sufferings were awful. Well, if you didn't want to do that, you could try what they call the rich man's route and take a boat all the way. You take a boat all the way around, and then through the Gulf of Alaska, the Bering Sea, and then a steamboat to take you up the Yukon River to the confluence with the Klondike at what came to be Dawson City. They call that the rich man's route because they charged you an arm and a leg for a boat passage. And whether or not that was worth it, we'll leave to a gentleman from Ashland, a former railroader, a brakeman named Alfred M. Smith, who tried that and then later reported back. Says he was 2 months and 3 days at sea on a boat that drew 2.5 feet of water, being the first flat-bottom boat ever to steam across the Bering Sea. Well, that sounds like it might be useful on a river, but the way it worked out on the Bering Sea, anybody watch The Deadliest Catch? That's not exactly a mill pond. I tell you, it's the last one I ever want to cross in, said Mr. Smith. We had a rough time of it. There were 42 started and 18 got here, the rest being lost. We were helpless on the Pacific Ocean in the storm for 9 days and finally gave up all hope, but finally landed here. Another route that's shown kind of truncated was the All-American route, they call it, which started out at the port town of Valdez, and then you had to go up and over a humongous glacier. And that was a very bad idea. Very few people even started that. Apparently, about 3,500 people attempted that trail. Only 200 actually managed to complete it. Among the people who didn't complete it was a father and son from Ladysmith. Ole and Holger Evgon, the freezing of the Evgons, father and son, is particularly sad, said the newspaper. They started for Valdez, but on getting well toward the summit of the glacier, found their feet freezing. Both started back. The son gave his father some extra wrappings for his feet, and as a result froze both of his legs in a few minutes and was unable to proceed. He bade his father goodbye and compelled him to move on without him. Then the boy lay down in the snow to die. His body probably will never be recovered. The father reached camp badly frozen and is not expected to live. So that was the Valdez route, which never turned out to be popular. The routes that were by far the most heavily traveled are the ones that, let's go back there, the ones that run from the coast in Alaska, from towns. You see Juneau on the map there. That wasn't a real big deal then, but Skagway and a town called Dyea, D-Y-E-A, pronounced Dyea, those were the heads, the trailheads, the two alternate trails that proceeded to the mining area. From Skagway at the south, there was what they called the White Pass Trail. It was the Skagway. The advantages had a better harbor, but the trail was longer, and it was arguably a more difficult trail, though I'm not sure about that. But one section of the trail from Skagway up through the mountains was so arduous, and it got the name Dead Horse Canyon for the reason so many horses died in that particular stretch as the men pushed and whipped and whatever the poor horses until they fell. And quite literally, you know, you had to walk around the carcasses of horses. And in the can-do spirit that characterized the pioneers, somebody said, you know, we can make money here. Guys are going to be hungry, and at this point, they're going to eat horse meat. So more than one entrepreneur set up a little snack stand, basically selling fried roadkill to the prospectors on the way. And we're going to come back to one particular guy who did that toward the end of the program. Skagway itself gained a reputation as a really lawless town. No better than hell on earth, it was described as. And it was the town very quickly had been taken over by a gang run by a former confidence man down in the States went by the name of Soapy Smith. Doesn't sound too fierce, but apparently he was a real mean son of a gun and kind of ran the town with an iron fist until somebody just took exception and plugged him one, and then Soapy Smith was pushing up daisies. In contrast, though, when you got into Canada, the Mounties were there in force. The Canadian government was not about to put up with any guff from these lawless American types, and they sent out a large contingent of Mounties, and then when that wasn't enough, they sent out an even bigger contingent of Mounties. And this is the place really where the Canadian Mounted Police got their reputation. They kept a tight lid on the goings-on, starting right off the bat. As they say, you came over to the border, they wanted to make sure you had your year's worth of food. They kept a real close watch on goings-on in Dawson City, the central point there, and a very different atmosphere from the way it was on the American side of the border. Skagway eventually became the terminus of a railroad, and that pretty much killed the other trail dead, because who wants to haul all your supplies over the passes when you can take a train? Our guys, however, took the other trail, which starts in a place called Dyea. And I'm out of sequence there. There's Dyea right there. The main difference between Dyea and Skagway as far as the experience of the miners, the trail is a little shorter, but among other things, right off the bat, there's no docks to speak of. This is a later picture when they've actually managed to build a bit of a wharf. But what would happen would be the ships would let you off right out there on the beach on these wide flats, and you had to hustle all your stuff up to dry land before the tide came in. And again, always thinking away your money. Some guys were down there, they would carry packages for you, and the going rate was carrying a package, it would be $20 an hour. and low tide, and if the tide was coming in, $50 an hour. You don't want to pay it, that's fine. Hope everything is okay with getting wet. And then from there was overland by way of the Chilkoot Pass to the headwaters of the Yukon River. Chilkoot Pass was the other problem with the Dai route. In a minute you'll see why. And once you cross the pass, then you make your way to a couple of lakes, and you go down the Yukon River, and there you build yourself a boat and make your way down to the confluence at Dawson City, and that's roughly 400 miles. And that's the trip that our guys are starting out on this cold night in February. These guys here. Apparently, they came up with the idea in September, maybe about 2 months, no more, than after that gold-laden ship arrived in San Francisco. The Washburn Times, September 29th, 1897. Front page article, "The Klondike Fever has reached Washburn, and some of the cases will never be cured until the afflicted ones will cross the passes and are safely landed in the land of ice and snow." It's pretty hard to tell just how large a crowd Washburn will send, but it's put down as a certainty that a few of our good, husky, and able-bodied men will go hunting for nuggets of the precious yellow stuff before many moons change. They are men of firm resolution and determined character, all having good, robust frames and plenty of good staying qualities. And if they don't bring back some of the yellow metal from the Klondike, it will be because it has all been picked up before their arrival, which will probably be early next spring. So the Washburn Times is really boosting this. And as autumn turns to winter, sure enough, our fellows here are making their plans and getting ready. They start buying their gear and assembling everything together in a building at the corner of Washington Avenue and 3rd Street. They either built or bought, it's not clear which, about a half a dozen big sleds. They've got tents, and they ordered clothes to keep them warm, and sure enough, here we go. The paper reports, the dress of the party consists of heavy Mackinaw clothes, heavy footwear, and fur caps. Fur robes will be used for bedding. All the tents are the most desirable quality. I'm sorry? Right. By mid-January, everything is set. The paper reports a big announcement. On the night of February 2nd, the Washburn expedition to the Klondike will leave Washburn. The party is made up of as good quality men as ever started on such a trip. They have money, nerve, and intelligence, and are prepared to meet any kind of emergency that might arise. The trip that these gentlemen propose to take seems like a most hazardous one, yet they start out full of hope and determination. It seems that they surely ought to succeed. They are all sober, intelligent, and hardy men. The party will be composed of P.J. Peterson, W.H. Smith, William Olson, Oscar Lundgren, Charles Olson, and Dave Headland of this city, and Ed Hemingway of St. Paul, and a gentleman named Anderson from Rice Lake. So there's a half a dozen guys from Washburn, along with 2 friends from elsewhere that have attached themselves to the party. And then the paper introduces the Washburn fellows by name. Mr. Peterson is a merchant, ex-town treasurer of this city, and leaves a good business here in charge of his partner. Pete Peterson with a D, however you pronounce it in those days. Interesting fellow. He was indeed, he had been the city treasurer for Washburn. Pete, man, I see you out there. You're going to like this because the balances ran short and he had been arrested. Through no fault of his own.
Of course.
Guy was as honest as the day was long, as far as I can tell. He was in the treasurer's office when that thief named A.C. Probert was our mayor. And Probert was siphoning off all the money, and Peterson was the one who got arrested for it. He managed to clear his name. But if I was in his shoes, I'd be quite happy to kiss Washburn goodbye for a while. But anyway, all things seem to work out for Mr. Peterson. Again, the day, being a municipal office had to be a little bit different then than it is today, I would think. Dave Hedlund, on the left, top rather, is one of our representative Scandinavians and is a member of the Board of Supervisors of Washburn. And down to the right, William Olson is a young man who has spent many years here, and besides conducting the transfer business of Washburn, in other words, he was into hauling and what they had for trucking in those days called drayage, is a member of the firm of Estabrook and Olson, the furniture dealers. Estabrook and Olson were not only the furniture dealers, they were also the undertakers for the town. You build furniture, you can build coffins. Oscar Lundgren and Charles Olson, Oscar to the left, Charles Olson to the right, are well and favorably known young men and have the necessary qualities needed for the hardships anticipated on the long journey. Mr. Smith is a member, not shown here. Mr. Smith is a member of the firm of Babcock and Smith, who are extensive quarrymen, and is also president of the school board. Mr. Hemingway, again from Rice Lake, not shown, from St. Paul rather, not shown here, is a traveling salesman who visits here occasionally and is built of the right kind of material to succeed. You notice something? There's no miners in the group. There's no loggers. There's no professional outdoorsmen, as far as I can see, among any of them, which makes it all the more amazing what they endured and survived on. Speaking of the stuff that they endured, I mean, it started before they left, because a week before the trip, Mr. Hemingway, the traveling salesman from St. Paul, is on his way up here to join the rest of the party. He's in the train now on the way from Duluth to Ashland. He's got his supplies in the baggage car, and in his coat, he's got $540 for the trip, which would be equivalent today to about $15,000 in cash. And he goes to the smoking car to have a smoke and leaves his jacket in his compartment.
Oh.
And when he gets back, the coat is gone. All his money for the trip, equivalent to 15,000 smackers today. And he's not going to put up with that. He gets off the train at Ashland. It's past midnight at this point. But fortunately, he has talked to people on the train, and it turns out some stranger got off the train at Maple. And as a freight leaving Ashland for Duluth, he gets a friend. They get on the freight train in the caboose, and they get let off at Maple, and find out who the guy was, went to his house, found him asleep, and there's the coat at the foot of his bed. No money in it, though. They wake the guy up. He says he doesn't know what they're talking about, and here's the way the newspaper puts it. After being handled roughly, he mended putting it inside his shirt and came to the conclusion that he better give it up, which he did after taking a good look at the size of his opponents. So, dodged a bullet there. And now, here comes the part that's most exciting to me, because I started digging into this almost a year ago when I was doing research for the program on A.C. Probert, and I'm finding all these newspaper articles about the Klondike expedition, and I got a lot of great material, and then about a month ago I had an absolute windfall, and I got a phone call from a gentleman in the audience here, Mr. Dick Olson, who said, listen, my great-grandfather was on that trip, and I have his diary. Would you like to take a look at it?
Oh, wow.
And I just got my jaw off the floor and said, yeah, maybe. But I gotta tell you, I mean, this is just a personal aside. It's one of the things I love about living in this town. We're small enough, people know each other, and word on something like this can get out. And the kind of people who who live in Washburn, well, the ones out there are hardy and adventurous and a finer group. Folks here in Washburn and in this room, and we deal with every day, are the kind of folks who call you up and say, you want to borrow my precious family heirloom for a couple of weeks? Thanks, Nick. So anyway, let's take a look at this diary, which I certainly did. The diary was written by Charlie Olson, who is family experts in the audience here. But in any event, Charlie and Bill Olson were either brothers or cousins, very close. And Bill was grandfather of some folks, great-grandfather of some folks we know very well. Charlie is the one who kept the diary. And we have a day-to-day account of the first part, at least, of their trip. And why don't we take a ride with them for the rest of this program and accompany them right alongside. On February 2nd, that cold night, everybody else is trudging up the hill home in the cold, and these guys are settling down for a train ride. 9:37 p.m., left Washburn, bound for Klondike. 5 of us in the party, had 25 dogs and a carload of baggage. Had lots of fun until we got sleepy. Then we tried to sleep, but could not, as we had no sleep. Arrived at St. Paul on the 3rd at 6:50 a.m., had breakfast in the car, and started to take care of our animals. You never heard such noise. They were so restless. Next day they changed trains, woke up early and found ourselves on the Minnesota prairies. Rode all day, played cards, talked of Klondike and of home. Got acquainted with lots of people bound for the Klondike. 3 carloads just on our train. We enjoyed the day very much, had supper, smoked, and went to bed. Next day was kind of boring. Woke up and found that we were well into Dakota and Montana. Nothing but snow-covered prairie. It looked worse and more lonesome than the Wisconsin pine stumps. And if you've seen pictures of what this area looked like right after the loggers were left, you know what kind of comparison that is. On the other hand, the scenery improves the day after that, February 6th, going through the Cascade Mountains. We saw some beautiful scenery, streams, mountain peaks, and canyons that we had never seen as fine scenery before. Then we came to the switchbacks. They were simply grand. They commenced to climb, zigzag until they got on top. Then we were thousands of feet in the air, and when we looked down at the bottom, it looked like a dream. Men looked like flies and everything in comparison, and then we zigzagged down the same way we came up. And then later that day, we came to Seattle, and there we commenced toward hunting for a place for the dogs, and hard work it was till 4:30 in the morning, and did not go to sleep at all. Well, the next day, they bought more gear on top of all the stuff that they had toted along with them. Now they buy the second installment of stuff to take up there. As soon as we got our breakfast, we went uptown and commenced to look around for outfits and found a good place, found everything fairly cheap, and what a fine large outfit. It got into the dock, and there we had more trouble about freight. We contracted in the East for $10 a ton, and they wanted $17.50 now. Well, O.J. Anderson, the guy from Rice Lake who went with the group, gives a little more detail about that in a letter that he wrote and was published in the newspaper. We made 2 mistakes coming here in Dyea, here to Dyea, he writes later. First, in outfitting at Seattle. Seattle is full of material for a trip like ours, but the freight rates on an outfit to this place is something appalling. Had we outfitted in Juneau, which is only 100 miles from here, we could have saved freight money and lots of trouble. As it is, we are here and our goods are on their way from Seattle. So much for mistake number 1. We'll get to mistake number 2 later. Back to the diary. That night, says Charlie Olson, we had dog music to our heart's content. They were in the basement of the hotel. Yeah, I've traveled with a large dog. I can't picture traveling with 25 of them, though. You guys got a place for my puppies? Yeah, well, I guess that was Seattle in those days. And then it goes a little crazy the next day at the dock. Just a little. Got up early and went to the dock to see if everything was all right. They told us to bring the dogs, and we'd done so. Then we hauled our bags. This is an all-day job, hauling and coaxing and swearing and cussing and everybody climbing over each other, several thousand men all wanting to be the first. But we finally got through. Well, O.J. Anderson's letter gives some more details, and apparently it really did turn into a total 3-ring circus. Just as the ship was about to sail from Seattle, the transportation company informed our Washburn company that there was not room on the boat for our dogs and outfits. And notwithstanding the emphatic protests, unloaded the dogs and outfits onto the dock. W.H. Smith, P.J. Peterson, and Oscar Lundgren decided to remain in Seattle until the next boat to bring the transportation company to time. But before they decided to do this, the boys held the boat at the dock by legal proceedings for 5 hours. Then they decided to remain and see the trouble through while the rest of the party went on. But all the blankets, tents, and the rest of the outfit were on the dock, and that was a big point to the disadvantage of those who would arrive at Skagway in the advance of the rest of the party. So, what do the guys do? Not to be dismayed. The ship began to move off, and as it did so, the hatchway was raised to pull up the gangplank. Smith, Peterson, and Lundgren were ready, and in an instant they picked up the necessary supplies and threw them aboard the boat. It was too late for the ship's officers to protest. They had been outwitted, and the party going on had their supplies. So in the end, the steamship company learned a lesson about dealing with stubborn cheeseheads. The boys established their rights in a way that we would expect from them, says the newspaper, and they will doubtless have no further trouble with the steamship companies during the rest of the voyage. Well, okay. So you got half the party still on the dock in Seattle, but Charlie and Bill and Pete are on their way north. And Charlie, writing in his diary, sits down to enjoy the ride. He writes about seeing seals, icebergs, and just general fine scenery. They make a stop at Victoria, British Columbia for licenses of some sort. Came to Victoria at 9 a.m., then a wild rush for our licenses. Everybody run. It was 1.5 miles to the government office, but we beat the whole crowd and got our papers quick. Onward, they make a stop at Vancouver, and then the nice scenery is no longer so nice, and the sea gets a little rougher. February 11th, raining all day, came on Queen Charlotte Sound. What a rough and some men seasick. But not any of us in our party, though. We're all feeling good. Guess if you're used to Lake Superior, what the heck. February 12th, sea a little rougher, a lot more men seasick, but us Washburn boys felt like peacocks. So nothing is simple. Next day, February 13th, arrived at Juneau, 6 p.m., ran into the dock and stowed in the beam. Had to lay up until 12 p.m. Finally, at February 14th, almost 2 weeks after they left Washburn, landed Skagway, was transferred to an open scow and towed by a small steamer up halfway to Dyea, left to get ashore as best as we could. We stayed on the scow till the tide went down, which was 11:30 p.m. That's the scene at Dyea, folks.
Yeah.
That's what, where their stuff was dumped off. There we got teams to haul us and baggage, 50 cents per piece, and 50 cents a piece for each of us, rather. Got into a rough and tumble hotel, paid 50 cents a bed, and to furnish our own bedding, 50 cents for meals. And that doesn't sound like much, but in those days, they were gouging. So the next day, started out to find a camping place, found a good one, and pitched tents. Got settled, all but the carpets down. And then they sat and waited for the rest of the party to come up from Seattle. And they waited, and they waited. February 17th, can't do anything but wait for the boys and dogs. It's bitter cold and blowing a hurricane. And they sit there for a week. February 19th, if they hadn't already got an idea of how rough things are going to be, they got a hint. February 19th, cold, windy, and disagreeable. 2 men froze to death on the summit.
Oh.
More days pass. Now it's February 24th. I've been sitting there for a week. Same thing over again, getting anxious about the boys. And then finally, after a week and a day of cooling their heels at Dyea, February 25th, boys arrived in good health, dogs all right, had lots of work, and then got them there, got them home, and got sleighs and everything ready for the start. And then 3 more days were sitting around. February 26th, no work, bad weather. And the same for the next day and the day after that. And then finally, February 28th, our first load. They're on the trail now, finally. And you see the two trails, down there, Skagway at the bottom, going up the White Pass route, and from Dyea to the left on the bottom, going up the Chilkoot Pass route. And by that one, that you're going to head over the pass, Chilkoot Pass, over the mountains, into Canada, and then up to a couple of lakes there, which are the headwaters of the Yukon River. And away they go in stages. A modern historic account basically sums up what they did. The average man took about 40 trips to haul his ton of supplies 33 miles to Lake Bennett. That's 2,600 exhausting miles over the icy trail, up the, quote, golden stairs at the summit, through blizzards and sub-zero conditions. Back and forth with all that gear. Now, they don't say really whether, how much they carried and how much they packed by dog sled, but, and later on, it sounds like they mostly carried it themselves. A fellow from Ashland who was along at about the same time, though, gave a little more vivid description of what the trail was like. Holton Scott, his name was. He wrote some letters which turned up in the Ashland newspaper. Perhaps a short description of the trail might be of some interest to the people of Ashland. The trail from Dyea to Lake Lindeman is just 28 miles, but a person going over it will swear that it is 50 miles. The first 9 miles is comparatively easy, the only disagreeable feature being that you have to ford a swift stream about half a dozen times. It is necessary to wear hip rubber boots, and yours truly, not being very high, these boots did not prevent me from getting wet every time I crossed. Then you come to the canyon, 2 miles in length, which is about as mean a piece of road as anyone has ever tried to get over. It is up and down steep hills, and the mud is about knee-deep at all times. Your Ashland mud is not eligible with the Alaska mud. To call your Ashland mud is not with the Alaskan mud. Now, the first week, they're hauling stuff back and forth just on that section of trail, and they stop at a place that gained the name Sheep Camp. March 8th, moved to Sheep Camp and camped in 14 feet of snow. Now, a fellow from Ladysmith who was up there talked about Sheep Camp. The head of the canyon, the valley widens out a half a mile for 2 miles. Here is Sheep Camp, a dirty village with about 100 new houses and nearly 1,000 tents. This is 14 miles from Dyea, and it's where the trouble begins. Remember that mud? The trouble hasn't begun yet. Here, stout hearts weaken and weak ones fail. From here to the summit is 4.5 miles. And in that distance, we go up 5 hills that from the top of either, a man looks like a small boy. And I'm impressed that the people could leave all their gear just lying there, and then back and forth, more packs, put it all down there. And the only thing I can think is the consequences of stealing from somebody's pack were fatal. They weren't about to write the guy a summons and send them to court if they caught someone stealing from your pack. The life was cheap. March 9th, haul from Dyea in Canyon City, 2 men died at Sheep Camp today. Yeah, like I say. March 10th, stormy, could not work, stayed in tent all day. March 11th, hauled to Stonehouse, stormy and cold. What's the Stonehouse? Well, Mr. Fritz from Ladysmith explains. From Sheep Camp, the trail goes up to the Stonehouse, a large rock. Oh, okay. 2 miles through a rough valley about 100 yards wide from Stonehouse to the Scales, 2 miles. The Scales was basically this place at the foot of the bad slope. You had Native American packers who were there, and they figured we can make money too, and they would carry stuff for the prospectors, and they charged by the pound. And then that's where the Scales were. They call this place at the foot of the steep pass, the Scales. Okay, there we come to the foot of the summit, as it is called. Yesterday morning, I made my first trip to the summit. In the afternoon, my first trip over. When I came to the Scales in the morning, there was a few clouds. When I saw the long line of men reaching and disappearing in the clouds, I must admit I came near weakening. Now, this is what it looks like today in summertime. They were there in March. Okay, and for a few more days, that's all they're doing is relaying stuff from sheep camp to the scales. And noting, minor events that happened. March 14th, man shot at sheep camp. 2 partners quarreled and 1 shot. Also, a gambler shot at the canyon, both dead. And then on March 17th, he writes, hauled on hills, getting worse, so steep you can't stand up. And that's the scales. Those are people. Holton Scott from Ashland writes, now your troubles begin. From sheep camp, which is about 1,000 feet above sea level, foot of the mountain, the scales that it is called, you're 2,000 feet up now, and that's before you rise the big hill, which you all read so much about. From the scales, it is almost perpendicularly up and down. It is the hardest 1,500 feet to get up that you ever can imagine. With a pack on, there are many places going over that hill that you have to crawl, and to slip with a load would be disastrous. I saw a man take a fall, and he was fortunate that he only broke his arm. Well, let's take a little closer look. They call that the golden staircase. Somebody with an idea went up there in a shovel and an ice axe and chopped up steps, and he charged people to walk up the steps. Again, the entrepreneurial spirit runs well. And let's take a little closer look at some of the other guys. Let's zoom in. Oh, you see there? I don't know if you can make out the tracks on the screen there. Those are guys coming down. It was a lot quicker going down than going up. As a matter of fact, according to Holton Scott, it takes about 3 minutes to go from the top of the mountain down to the bottom. The thing you have to be really, really careful about is not getting turned around on the way. Yeah, and that's what our Washburn guys did for the next week. March 21st, commenced to pack up the Chilkoot Pass. It is a dandy, you bet, says Charlie. You see men climbing up the pass. They cut steps like a stairway all the way up, and they disappear in the clouds. It is a daisy, you bet. Some of the fellows in Washburn ought to try it. March 22nd, same thing all over again. March 25th, same thing all over again. And then we get a letter on that day from Billy Olson, the cousin, or brother, Sheep Camp, Alaska, to his friend Dell down here. Dear friend Dell, I received your letter on March 2nd and was glad to hear from you. I suppose you think it queer that we're still at Sheep Camp, but I assure you, if you saw the pass and the roads, you would not wonder about us being so slow. Dell, the pass is a holy terror. You can put that down. Here, hundreds of men get discouraged as soon as they see the pass and turn back home. But do not think for a moment that we are coming back so soon. You know what I told you before I left, and you can gamble on it. And they're hauling for another week. And then on April 3rd, an event that is remembered in the history of the Klondike. It is very stormy today, and we did not work. We had some awful snowstorms and slides. There were about 100 people buried. They're digging for them now and finding lots of them. Poor fellows, but you can't tell how many are in there. It's an event that's going to be called the Palm Sunday Avalanche. You can see them trying to dig out the victims. This was one of the great disasters of the Klondike Gold Rush, and our men were right there on the scene. And if they hadn't sensibly decided to stay in the tent that day, they might never have returned. The next day, April 4th, still stormy, they've taken out 118 from the snowslide. Well, this too shall pass. Eventually they get across the pass, and they're heading now to Lake Lindeman and then on to Lake Bennett. And it's a lot easier than climbing the pass, but that does not imply easy. April 8th, went to Lake Bennett and broke through the river between Lindeman and Bennett and had to jump into the river to save the goods. Another week of hauling back and forth, up and down, and then comes my least favorite part of the whole story. Remember O.J. Anderson and his, this was the first of 2 mistakes we made? Well, he continued. Number 2 was in taking the dogs. They are a nuisance and have no special value here. And Bill Olson writes in his letter, the dogs were an expensive experiment. And Charlie writes in his diary, April 15th, moved camp and went out looking for timber. While the boys rigged up the camp in the evening, we shot 12 dogs. And then the order of the day is to build boats. As a modern author wrote, most stampeders needed to build their own boats, having declined to drag a boat over the pass. That's an understatement. And, you know, to build a boat, what do? Well, you need wood. And the first thing you got to do is go out and cut trees. I mean, this is you know, how resourceful they had to be. Build boat. First, cut a tree. And he says, went out and got timber, got some fair timber for this country. Well, of course, by that point, the place was pretty well clear cut. They had to hunt pretty far. And then they started sawing. April 17th, bark logs and skidded them to our saw pit. Now we're ready to saw timber. And the modern historian writes, the preferred wood-cutting technique, known as whip sawing, led to more than a few disagreements and fights. Logs placed on stands were sawed by one man standing on top of the log with one end of the saw, and a second man standing below the log holding the other end. The work was so hard that no matter which position a man took, it was easy for him to believe that he was the one doing all the work. And they did that for 11 days. April 18th, began sawing lumber and found it to be hard work, but got along well. April 20th, sawed lumber, alone getting fine. 9 more days of sawing this lumber. April 29th, finished up with sawing and was glad of it. Time to build boats. April 30th, built a rack to build our boats. Sunday, May 1st, commenced to build boats. The sun is very warm. The mosquitoes are beginning to bother us. Like they needed that. May 8th, first boat done. Our boat is finished and we tried it today. It is a dandy and does not leak a bit. It's 28 feet long, 8-foot beam. May 10th, 2 men drowned just above us. May 14th, worked on boats, received that 2 men were shot just below here by Indians. And then on May 15th, something really unusual happens. May 15th, lady doctor moved into camp here. No idea what this was going. There were not, the sex ratio there was about 9 to 1. 9 guys for every woman. And a lady doctor moved into camp. Doesn't say anything more about that. I'd love to find out more. 9 more days of building boats. May 21st, finished the small prospecting boat. She is a dandy. We called her the Washburn. Another week of boat building, finished our last boat. She is a clipper. Think we can start to move. Everything is rigged up in fine shape. You'd ought to see it. We have 5 boats rigged with sails and tackle. So, I mean, built by hand from trees. Okay?
All right.
The school board president and the town treasurer and the other guys, no flies on them, I'll tell you that much. Okay, and they've taken now 4 months to get to this point. They left in the beginning of February, and now it is June the 1st. Set sail. Started this morning from Caribou Crossing, sailed to Big Windy Arm and got a fine wind, got to Tagish Post at 5:30. They have 400 miles of river now to traverse before they can even start turning a shovel. And what did they see? Well, they get to Tagish Post that evening. There were over 3 miles of solid boats standing just as close as they could be packed in. Then we hustled around and had a hard time to get our clearing papers, but got to bed at 12:30. What that reflects is, again, the Mounties and their tight control. They got tired of fishing drowned people out of the river. So they registered each boat. Each boat got a number and an ID, and the Mounties kept track of it, and eventually they instituted a policy where you had to have a qualified professional river guide on the boat. I don't think it was that way for these guys. And then they also put a thing, if any ladies and children on the boat are not allowed to go through the rapids, they would have to get off and walk around and be picked up. Again, the Mounties, tough guys, and they didn't want any garbage from the Americans. So 3 miles, waiting in line, get inspected by the Mounties, and on the third day, they reached their first set of rapids. June 3rd, 4 o'clock, we went down to look at Canyon and White House Rapids, and they are dandies. He likes that. You bet the water is high and fast rolling and dashing. Went back and took down the boats. It was exciting, you bet.
Don't you know?
2 days later, June 5th, the foot of the lake and down 30 Mile River, it had a hard time to keep off the rocks. And after a week on the river, the diary begins to trickle down. I think he's getting a little tired of it. June 8th, down the Lewis River and landed at Big Salmon. Well, that gives us an idea. That's Big Salmon is about a third of the way down, about 115 miles down. Less than a third, but they've got still several hundred miles. June 15th, found we're fixing to run short of grub. So we divided up, and Charles and I went up 40 miles. This confuses me as a historian a little bit because it's Charles's diary. At least everything indicates family knowledge, and the fact that it says Charlie Olson at the top of the page. So I don't know who this other Charles is. And this is when he really starts kind of condensing things. It took 3 days more, 16, 17, and 18. And then we found nothing, turned back, and had a hard time to get back upstream. 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24.
Wow.
And then he says, we rode on a raft of logs we made, and, that's a log raft, and had a hard time to keep it right side up. And finally, the last entry in the diary, June 27th. Down the Yukon, more fine scenery, landed at Stewart River and camped. Made up to go upriver about 140 miles more and are getting ready. So the diary ends, they haven't even gotten to Dawson City yet to start digging. And we have to hunt for information as best we can other ways. The Washburn paper, which had been enthusiastic in its coverage of the miners, has also begun to lose interest. I suppose partly because they're not hearing that much from the guys who are now well into the interior, but also because the Spanish-American War has started. And there are a bunch of Washburn boys down on their way to fight in Cuba or off to the Philippines, and that's filling up the news columns at that point. And so it's not until November, long way after that, we hear anything. The Washburn men in the Klondike are heard from occasionally, and they are all more or less interested in mining property, which all expect to turn out well. W.H. Smith, in a recent letter, says he may be home for a short time before spring, but all are full of hope and are working away trying to get the share of the yellow stuff. Prospects are encouraging, so they write and are keeping everlastingly at work. And we're also very lucky to have this picture of them hard at work. Another treasure from Dick that he loaned me to scan. And if you take a look, best I can tell you, this is well past where we're climbing the passes and all. We are actually out in the Klondike country now, and you can see that they got the shovels. If you look over there, you've got a windlass of some sort, leading with the rope leading down. You got that frame there. So apparently somebody's underground digging and they're hauling stuff up. As was that Jim who pointed that out? Yeah, they're high up. There's no other miners around there. It kind of tells you that they're getting the late, they got their late in the game. Not necessarily the prime territory. And we can only make inferences from here on out. One of the things I have to tell everybody, this is very much a work in progress. There's more questions, many questions that remain to be answered, and I hope to dig into them and find more. But we now and then we do get reports, and unfortunately one of the news reports is a sad one. You remember in the beginning where it's talked about saying goodbye the last time for loved ones. December 7th, 1898, the young son of Mr. and Mrs. Peter J. Peterson died of diphtheria last Saturday. Mr. Peterson is in the Klondike country and has been there since last February. The child was buried here this weekend. So, yes, indeed, there was at least one final parting there. And then, nearly a year after the departure, January 11th, another sign from the men in the Klondike. Home from Dawson, W.H. Smith returns from the Klondike. W.H. Smith returned Tuesday from Dawson City, Alaska. Still can't get it right. Where he has been for nearly a year. Mr. Smith went directly to his home at Houghton. He is the second of the delegation that left here to return. So we don't know who was the first one to come back, but Mr. Smith from Houghton was the second. And then it's quiet again until the following August, when the paper reports letters have been received within the last few days from the Washburn boys who went to the Klondike a year and a half ago. They have returned from the frozen north and are now in San Francisco, where they expect to remain for several days. And the news everybody's waiting to hear, none of the boys have struck it rich. But it is understood they have all done fairly well, and that what they have cleared up will repay them for time and money invested. Nice to know after all that you broke even. A couple weeks later, the wives are impatient to see their husbands, 4 ladies, Mrs. Hedlund, 2 Mrs. Olsons, and Mrs. Lundgren, hop on the train and head to Minneapolis to meet their husbands who are going to be arriving there. And then 2 more weeks, we have a more detailed report. Klondikers returned. William Olson returned home Thursday morning after an absence of over a year and a half in the Klondike country. Charles Olson, David Hedlund, and Oscar Lundgren preceded him by a few days. P.J. Peterson, the remaining member of the party, will likely be back about the 1st of October. The party have but little to say regarding the riches they obtained, yet they all did better than they would if they had remained at home and feel well satisfied with their trip. The Klondike region has now become a thing of the past for fortune hunters, as all the claims have either been taken or withdrawn from the market. While much gold is being taken out, yet it is confined to a few of the largest claims, and the time has gone by for others to go in with the hope of accomplishing anything. And if you look at those faces, the guys that we saw in that photo, you see the beards and the dirt and everything. The last line of that particular article, none of the party will go back to the gold fields. So, the legacy of the Klondike Gold Rush. Where did this leave everybody? Where did what happened? Well, according to the history books, about 100,000 prospectors, give or take a couple, left for the Klondike, and of that 100,000, about 30,000 made it all the way through all those trials and tribulations that we just went over. Our Washburn guys were among that 30% who actually made it as far as the Klondike. And of those 30,000 fellows who made it to the Klondike and started digging, no more than 200 or 300 actually got anywhere near rich. And unfortunately, I guess our guys from Washburn were not among them. Remember the folks who actually discovered it, James Carmack and his Native American wife Kate and her brother? They did sort of okay. James Carmack, the white guy, did fine. He took his money, ditched his Indian wife, and went down to the lower 48. Because they were not legally married, she was left penniless. However, her brother Jim, Skookum Jim, who had a portion of the claim, did basically okay. He made a fair amount of money, developed an alcohol problem and beat it, and lived a fairly long and comfortable life and made sure his sister was well taken care of. So it's nice every now and then to hear a story where the native didn't get totally screwed. Skagway and Dawson City are now tourist towns. Skagway, of course, is the railhead for the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, which instantly made obsolete the other trails and now is a popular tourist route. Okay, Skagway, Dawson, tourist town. This is what Dyea looks like today, though. Complete ghost town. It's now incorporated within the boundaries of the Klondike National Historical Park, National Park Service. What else do we get? What is the rest of the legacy of the Klondike? Well, ice cream, for one thing. All right. The name Klondike was gold in those days, and sure enough, well, this one says quality since 1929, but actually the brand goes back a good decade before that. There was literature. It made the career for Jack London, and then we have the Call of the Wild and White Fang and those wonderful novels. The poetry of Robert W. Service, The Cremation of Sam McGee. I think that's probably the worst picture ever done of Clark Gable. Any movie fans here? I mean, you know, if I was Scarlett O'Hara, I would not have fallen for that guy, you know. As I say, here in Washburn, nobody in Washburn got rich, but from what I hear, at least a couple brought home a small bag or two of gold. I heard a story just this evening about a fellow had brought back a gold nugget and had it inlaid into the sights of a really nice rifle that he bought in Seattle on the way home. And I also hear by rumor from a very reliable source, there's a gentleman in the room right now who's wearing a tie pin made from a gold nugget inherited from his dad. So, yes, indeed. The legacy lives on. The legacy lives on in another way. Bill or William Olson formed a partnership with his cousin Olaf and formed a company called Olson and Olson Lumber and Dray. And as you can figure out, that's still around, but he is still around. It's, I think, one of the two oldest businesses in Washburn. And then there were some fortunes made in the Klondike, and then a couple of the names that you'll recognize, and among them, one of America's most famous billionaires. I had no idea. But, you know, the foundation of the fortune, well, what do you know? Also, this guy here, a German immigrant named Friedrich Drumpf. Mr. Drumpf. In 1894, he's in the U.S., the records show him in the U.S., running a hotel in the state of Washington. And 3 years later, he gets wind of the gold rush, decides he's going to make more money up there in the north. And he heads up to Skagway, and he's one of these guys who opens a little canteen alongside the Dead Horse Trail, which, as one historian put it, where weary travelers likely stop for a bite of Arctic roadkill. In 1898, Mr. Drumpf moved to Lake Bennett and opened up an eating establishment called the Arctic Restaurant and Hotel, which offered fine dining and lodging in a sea of tents. And pretty soon, he built a little shack, and the money was flowing in. He ended up building a 2-story hotel and restaurant. And in fact, it got a reputation as the place to go. There was a restaurant and saloon downstairs, and upstairs were private rooms where ladies transacted business with the miners. And in each room, they had a set of scales because the ladies preferred to take their earnings in gold. And Mr. Drumpf may or may not have got a cut of that, but he was certainly aware of what was going on because he wrote back a letter to one of the newspapers saying, "We have a fine establishment here for the single gentleman, but I would not advise respectable ladies to come here because what they will hear will be certainly repugnant to their senses. And what will come, it will come from depraved members of their own sex." So yeah, he knew what was going on, Mr. Drumpf. Mr. Drumpf got out while the getting was good. In 1901, he left the Klondike, bounced around, tried to go back to Germany, but for some reason they wouldn't let him back in, so he ended up in New York, where he started dealing in real estate. He died in the 1918 flu epidemic, but he had made enough money to leave it to his son and his wife to invest even more in real estate, and somewhere along the line he anglicized his name from Drumpf to Trump. The grandson of this saloon keeper slash courthouse owner. As they say, I'm not making this up. There, I checked sources. Believe me, I checked sources on this one. Believe me, I checked sources on this one. Anyway, back here in Washburn, on October 4th, 1899, the last member of the party came home. Peter J. Peterson returned home yesterday. He went with the party at the Klondike from here over a year and a half ago and is the last one to return. While Mr. Peterson has not accumulated any fortune, it is understood that he has done fairly well in the Klondike. He is being warmly greeted by his friends and his intention to settle down to business here again. And apparently that's exactly what he did, settle down to business, because a year later, Mr. and Mrs. P.J. Peterson rejoiced over the arrival of a boy and a girl twins at their home last Tuesday. And all I can think is they must have heard some amazing stories from their dad. I certainly had a good time digging some of them up, and I hope you folks enjoyed hearing what I've learned so far. Thanks so much. This is an exercise and you never know where the research is going to take you. Dick Olson, once again, you made this program for me, and I thank you very much for your generosity. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you all for coming.
Oh, she's doing marvelous. Yes. No, for the last few years, she's been out in Door County.